EXIM Bank definitely wants to be a part of Ukraine's energy development. Can we get the slides up? So this is my presentation. I'm looking forward to giving it to you. I realize that it's already almost half past, so I will go briefly through some of the points, and on the more applicable points, spend a bit more time. And Ukraine is near and dear to my heart, as you can imagine. As you heard, I was with EBRD prior to EXIM Bank and did quite a bit of engagement with U.S. companies on Ukraine. And look forward to carrying on that knowledge now that I'm back at EXIM, an institution I know well, and look forward to this discussion. Next slide. So a bit of history on EXIM Bank, and I like this picture because it definitely evokes history in the cars and the streetcar. But essentially, next year, EXIM Bank turns 90 years old. So we were founded in 1934. And the main thing to understand about EXIM Bank is we are the U.S. agency that supports U.S. exports, whether they're in the energy space or the agricultural space, commodity space, whatever is made in and exported from the U.S. potentially qualifies for EXIM Bank support. Next slide. And so in the mission of EXIM Bank, it's interesting. We're actually not a foreign policy bank. We're a domestic policy bank. Our mission is actually to help support U.S. jobs, but we do it by financing exports, financing overseas buyers of exports that are unable to acquire financing through the private sector. And this essentially is to level the playing field for U.S. exporters. And so, for us to do that, we look at, one, is there a U.S. export in the transaction? Two, is there a foreign buyer that's purchasing that U.S. export? So is there an underlying commercial contract? And then lastly, we are a bank. We're not a grant-making institution. We are an export credit agency, and so we do a credit analysis to understand whether we can get a reasonable assurance of repayment on every transaction. Next slide. So here's a bit of history. There's a lot of words and a lot of translation on this page, I realize, but the one thing I do want to highlight is in the second column, the last item. EXIM Bank knows and has in its history and DNA big projects and reconstruction. In fact, we were one of the administrators, we were the designated administrator of the economic cooperation plans that were a part of the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. So we played a critical role there. And that's why I'm saying, the future looks very good for EXIM Bank in Ukraine, as we have this experience in our past. And we look forward to engaging on companies and the government in Ukraine on potential future transactions now, as well as in the future. Next slide. And as you could see, through the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, the bank evolved, but still stuck to its mission of providing support to U.S. exporters that are selling products overseas. And in fact, if you notice in 2012, we are a counter-cyclical agency in that when there are global crises, obviously there's a lack of finance. And so EXIM Bank's portfolio tends to expand. And we saw this during the global financial crisis, where we hit the largest amount of support for U.S. exports at $35.8 billion, supporting about $50 billion in exports during the height of the financial crisis of the early 2010s. Next slide. So what does EXIM Bank offer? Like I said, we're a financing institution. We're a government financing institution, and we have three primary products. We have a debt product, which is either through a guarantee. So what we can do is we guarantee a bank's funding line to companies that's tied to the procurement of U.S. goods and services. For larger projects, we even have the ability to offer loans, direct loans, denominated in dollars to overseas buyers of U.S. goods and services. Next slide. And we also have an insurance product where we offer insurance to banks or to U.S. companies that offer credit lines to overseas buyers of U.S. goods and services. Both of these products are quite important when it comes to the procurement of renewable energy items, depending on whether it's a large project or maybe smaller items in a more distributional setting. Next slide. And this last slide is more for U.S. businesses, but it is important to know. We do offer working capital guarantees to U.S. businesses, and that's very important for them to execute on projects overseas. They may need to purchase additional goods and services in order to execute on a project, or they may need to post costly performance bonds that need high degrees of cash collateralization in order to post the requirements to perform on the underlying contract, and we provide support of that nature as well. Next slide. Now, the EXIM Bank doesn't operate on its own. We operate with a number of U.S. government partners like the Department of Energy, and I actually should add them to this list, my apologies, as well as multilateral partners like the OECD and the Berne Union, and other multilateral development banks. And lastly, we have a number of private sector partners as well. We have, of course, the banks that fund transactions against our guarantees, as well as other domestic partners within the U.S. that provide outreach to businesses on the opportunities overseas and how to work with EXIM Bank on those opportunities. Next slide. So what I basically say are the three main requirements of EXIM Bank in order for us, in order for you to know to call me or email me. Doesn't quite translate, but it's basically the 3 C's: country, content, and credit. So in Ukraine, we are open for business. We have what's called a country limitation schedule, which sets out every country out there, and our risk appetite, and we are open for business in Ukraine, despite the challenges, which have allowed us to offer some structuring challenges on our end when we have these transactions, but we can definitely consider them. Content, as mentioned several times, our financing and the amount of financing we can bring to the table is strictly tied to what's procured from the U.S. And so our ability of support is off of that particular number. And then lastly, credit. All of our exposures have to meet our credit standards. We do have those online. Essentially, it's a very lawyerly term, but we need to reach reasonable assurance of repayment. And we do that both with a qualitative and quantitative credit analysis on each transaction. Anybody who's done credit training or has done banking and underwriting courses in business school will know the 5 C's of credit. That underlies our analysis, among a number of other things. Next slide. We do have other requirements, but these requirements are kind of second-tier requirements, in that the first-tier requirements, the country, the content, and the credit, really drive the discussion. And then we have other requirements as well. For example, we have environmental and social impact assessments that need to be done. We cannot finance anything that's military related. We can't finance tobacco projects, things of that nature. Again, the content policy, which I've mentioned, And basically, how do we judge that is we get exporter certificates from U.S. companies that basically are the legal representation that indeed it's U.S. content. We do have some shipping requirements, as well as some of our pricing, as well as repayment terms are set at the multilateral OECD level, which we abide by as part of an agreement that binds different export credit agencies together. Next slide. And I will note, I do see questions are coming in the chat. I will address those as the presentation continues, as they may be answered by some of the slides coming up in the future, but I very much appreciate the questions. EXIM Bank also has a new program, and this could be of keen interest to Ukrainian companies and to the government. It's called our China and Transformational Exports Program. This is a relatively new program of EXIM Bank. It's a couple of years old, and it really focuses on two aspects. One, competition from China. We want to be able to neutralize subsidies that are provided by official Chinese banks through their export credit, tied aid, or blended finance programs that they have, so that we make sure that U.S. companies aren't being displaced by government-backed financing. It is a new tool in our toolkit that we can use, and as part of that tool, we can consider relaxation of some of our content criteria and some other things as well. And secondly, on certain transformational export areas, such as high performance computing, water treatment and sanitation facilities, fintech, renewable energy, storage and energy efficiency, which is important to this webinar in particular, semiconductors, those types of transformational export areas, we too can look at potentially alleviating some of the content requirements, our ability to marshal more local cost support for projects, as well as offering longer terms as well. Particular to renewable energy, we can consider repayment terms of up to 22 years. 22 years, which is almost like equity. I mean, that's typically long-term transactions are 10 to 15 years, 22 years for renewable energy. Next slide, please. So essentially, the purpose and the benefits of the program is to make sure that foreign buyers make decisions based on the underlying technology and not the financing involved. This is the CTEP program. And the benefits, as I mentioned, we can have more flexible rates, terms, and conditions. There are potential cover policy exemptions, doesn't apply to Ukraine, we're open in Ukraine, as well as a bit of alleviation on our content policy as well. Next slide. So when you look at the export credit landscape, you know, it's a competitive landscape. Most countries do have export credit agencies. Ukraine has EXIM. So, you know, we're just one of many that are in the export credit space as official government lenders that help to finance their companies, i.e. the U.S. company exports. Next slide. When a transaction comes into EXIM Bank, it does touch a number of divisions during the underwriting process. Most of our medium and long-term transactions, so these are transactions 3 up to 22 years if it's renewable energy, have a distinct process where, you know, the leads come in. My group, business development, helps work with companies to refine their projects and to get them application ready, whereby it then gets assigned to a loan officer so they can shepherd it through EXIM Bank's underwriting and approval process. Once that's done, typically the credit is documented via loan documents, and then once those are negotiated by the lawyers, they're signed and disbursement begins. And then once disbursement, of course, is complete, set against certain milestones in the underlying credit documentation, repayment begins. And so that's where EXIM Bank, and it moves over to our asset management division that does ongoing monitoring of the transaction, including all the covenants and loan agreements until the final payment comes in. Next slide, please. Now, the tenors that EXIM offers depends upon the product that's being financed, as well as the credit profile of the underlying buyer, and they're typically linked to asset life. And so, for example, a lot of commodities and consumables, as mentioned previously, are covered under our short-term programs, and the medium or longer term are usually for capital equipment, so longer life capital goods. And then, of course, repayment terms are factored in by the underlying project or the underlying company, and our assessment on their ability to repay over a certain time period. Next slide, please. Of course, processing time, that's also another key question. How long does it take? Is directly related to the complexity of the transaction. So as you can imagine, shorter term transactions are typically less complex, and longer term project finance structures are much more complex, and they take a bit more time as they tend to have a number of different parties involved in the transaction. Next slide. And again, as it comes to credit analysis, really what underpins our credit analysis are what we call the 5 C's of credit that are kind of learned in credit training class. You know, everything from the borrower's reputation to capacity, what's the evidence of the repayment ability as evidenced through financial statements and the project structure, what kind of capital is the borrower bringing to bear, i.e. what's the leverage ratio of the company or the underlying project, what's the collateral, and how well is the how valuable is the underlying collateral, and can it be converted in case of default into what value can be gleaned from it from a recovery process. And then lastly, conditions, which of course is a very much concern in Ukraine, is what's the current economic state, the trends, and the political events that are in the country where the project is being undertaken. And obviously that is a big issue currently in Ukraine, and is defining a lot of abilities of financial institutions, whether it's export credit agencies, DFIs, or commercial lenders in engaging that market. Next slide. So how does one approach EXIM Bank? Well, we have 3 different types of applications. The one I'm going to focus on mostly is the first one, a letter of interest. A letter of interest is a non-binding indication of interest that EXIM Bank is indeed interested in the particular transaction. These are typically have a quick turnaround time of 10 days, and it just requires some basic information to say, listen, EXIM Bank is aware of this transaction. We're open in the country. We understand there's going to be U.S. content, and we are interested in exploring this particular transaction further. A preliminary commitment is a bit more heft, as they say. It's a commitment by the board of directors of the bank that that EXIM Bank is prepared to finance a transaction provided that the underlying commercial contract is signed. So typically this is something for larger projects where a U.S. company is facing competition and they need a approved financial package as part of their bid documents, for example, to go after a particular opportunity. And lastly, as a final commitment application, that's a fully baked project. it goes through a full due diligence process at the bank, with the end result of giving an approval by our EXIM's board of directors, and then following quickly by documentation of the credit and an underlying disbursement, because at that time there is an underlying commercial contract that is being asked to be financed by EXIM Bank. Next slide. So we'll go through the working capital product really quickly. Next slide. This is essentially a product, again, where we provide a U.S. exporter with financing through a financial institution through a guarantee product, 100% unconditional, irrevocable, so that the U.S. exporter can execute on a contract with a foreign buyer. This really isn't of major concern to Ukrainian companies because this is a product for U.S. companies. But the one area where it should be noted is that these proceeds can be used for things like performance bonds, performance guarantees, such that a Ukrainian company or potential borrower, or I should say a potential buyer of the U.S. goods and services can get comfortable that the U.S. company can indeed execute on the underlying contract. Next slide. We can skip this slide given time. Next slide. So short-term insurance. Short-term insurance is again a product that we offer to financial institutions or to U.S. companies that offer credit lines to their foreign buyers. So for a Ukrainian company, what does this translate into? This essentially translates into working capital for your company, because you're not tying up cash in advance to purchase things from U.S. companies. We can do this either on a single buyer, where we underwrite one discrete buyer that's purchasing U.S. goods and services, or a portfolio of buyers that meet a certain criteria, again, predicated on that U.S. goods and services underlying contract. Next slide. So here's the structure, and how does it fit into renewable energy? Well, you know, with a lot of, and especially what's going on in Ukraine, there are a number of U.S. companies that sell solar battery systems for small scale use, for a residence, for a business, and these systems can scale for things like hospital facilities and things like that. And typically these are smaller ticket items that are sold either, you know, one or two offs or as a bulk purchase. And what we can offer is to a U.S. company that manufactures those an insurance policy that you can sell to your Ukrainian buyer on 60, 90, 180, up to 360-day terms against insurance offered by EXIM Bank. So that essentially is a supplier credit, or if you're a Ukrainian company, essentially working capital to purchase this equipment. It doesn't tie up your cash, so you can think about other issues in deploying that cash to reinvest in your business, or use it for other mechanisms. It's a product that we issue thousands and thousands of these policies a year, and it's used quite widely amongst a number of our customers. Next slide. We can also offer this to banks, where banks can offer a credit line to a foreign buyer of U.S. goods and services. And it works much the same way, but instead of the U.S. exporter offering a line of credit through an open account receivable, it's a bank that's offering a line of credit that's tied to the goods and services being bought from the U.S. against our insurance policy. Next slide. Also, another product we have that can be useful for Ukrainian companies purchasing equipment from the U.S. is we have a letter of credit insurance policy, especially when the events like Russia's full-scale invasion happen. A lot of banks get nervous, commercial banks, and they pull lines. or they look for credit enhancements on potential exposures or existing exposures. Trade finance, often letters of credit, are used to underpin a lot of trade finance transactions. And EXIM Bank can offer insurance to U.S. or international banks that are confirming or advising on letters of credits that are issued by Ukrainian banks. And so we can offer the insurance, which then allows the confirming bank or the advising bank in the U.S. Comfort in offering that confirmation. Next slide. Here's an example of a U.S. company that we've used in our short-term insurance program, Dematech. They're in the healthcare space, but essentially they sell on open account terms to a number of different companies across the globe, including countries like Egypt and others. And they offer all of their buyers credit terms, and it's backed up by insurance. Next slide. So medium-term insurance and guarantees. This is for capital equipment, and I do see that somebody has a question about John Deere equipment. Yes, we have financed a lot of John Deere equipment under our medium-term insurance program. Next slide. This is a product, and it's primarily a guarantee product, where we offer a 100% unconditional and irrevocable guarantee to a financial institution that's lending, term lending, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years to a foreign buyer that's purchasing U.S. goods and services. A lot of this equipment is kind of typically smaller capital equipment. So if we think of like road construction equipment, we can think of agricultural equipment, whether it's irrigation pivots or it's tractors themselves. In the power space, things like generators, battery packs, again, distributed generation equipment, things of that nature. So what we offer is this guarantee to a financial institution, which then allows them to lend against U.S. government risk rather than the foreign buyer's risk. So EXIM Bank is taking on that risk, and that induces the financing facility to go forward. We also, and I want to note this, we can do over 30% local cost coverage. So that includes things like customs duties, in-country transport, civil works. If local civil works firms need to prepare a site, that type of stuff can also be financed off of whatever the amount is of the underlying U.S. supply contract. Next slide. And very similar, we can offer an insurance product. It's almost very similar to the guarantee product. It's a bit cheaper because there is a bit of conditions. It's not quite unconditional. There are conditions that are in the underlying insurance policy that allow it to be treated slightly different by the U.S. exporter if we're offering it to a U.S. exporter directly, typically through one of their financing entities, like John Deere Finance, for example, has a financial arm, or to a bank. Next slide. Now, the long-term guarantees and direct loans, again, they're very similar in structure to the medium-term product that I just discussed. Next slide. With the exception that they're typically for much larger capital goods and for larger transactions. So, for example, you can think of power facilities, of course. A lot of those are through this type of structure where EXIM Bank offers a guarantee to a financial institution that is supplying the credit to a foreign buyer of U.S. goods and services. Next slide. So project finance. This is the most complicated. Next slide. So typically these are for the very large transactions, the transformational projects, whether it's in the extractive industries, for mines, for things like critical minerals that are needed for the renewable energy space, whether it's refineries, whether it's combined cycle gas plants, utility scale solar, satellites. We offer a project finance structure underpinned by long-term loan guarantees or direct loans. Next slide. This is a scary diagram, and it's meant to be that way because, as many people on this call know, limited recourse project finance can get quite complicated, and it's typically for large transactions, as there are a number of players involved, and this, I hate to say it, is somewhat of a simplified diagram of a limited recourse power project, limited recourse project financing of a power project. And so, as you can imagine, with this number of contracts out there, and this type of structure and this number of players, transaction costs can run rather high, and so that's why it's typically for much larger projects. Again, we can finance the U.S. content of the project, of the underlying project. We can offer guarantees or direct loans to the project company to purchase the U.S. goods and services. And in some instances, through a guarantee product, we can even consider foreign currency guarantees, as I should have mentioned that during the medium-term discussion as well, in currencies like euros and other hard currencies. Next slide. And while it's a messy structure, it's doable, and we've done it before in a number of markets across the world. And I can give you in subsequent slides some examples of projects where the structure has been employed. But I do want to focus on the green economy transition. And EXIM Bank offers a number of enhancements to transactions in the renewable space that we can bring forward in order to make more renewable energy transactions happen. For example, I mentioned 22-year repayment terms. We can offer 22-year repayment terms, which is the maximum we're allowed under the OECD guidelines that EXIM Bank follows. And we can also offer local cost support of up to 50% of the U.S. scope of supply. So what does that mean? If you have a $200 million contract, of which $100 million is, or a $200 million project, of which $100 million is being sourced from the U.S., we can offer an additional $50 million on top of that $100 million as part of our local cost support. So our total financing can be much more than just the U.S. scope of supply. Next slide. So when it comes to electric power generation, again, our first true project financing was done all the way back in 1993. That is 20, 30 years ago, and we've had a lot of experience since then in all parts of traditional generation, renewable generation, and not only just in the generation, but also transmission, distribution. In the case of gas, for example, gas transmission infrastructure as well. So kind of across the entire value chain, even as going all the way into the mining space, as mentioned earlier. Critical minerals is a big area for EXIM Bank as well, which is critical, pardon the pun, in the renewable energy value chain. Next slide. We've also done a number of petrochemical projects as well. Not quite the focus of this, but these projects, they're illustrative of the fact that EXIM Bank involves itself in some very complicated projects that have complicated structures. Next slide. We also have a number of core competencies in the LNG space as well. which isn't the greenest of power out there, but it is a space that we do have a tremendous amount of experience in large projects that are quite complicated. Next slide, please. And of course, mining as well. We've involved ourselves in a number of mining projects. Critical minerals, as mentioned, is a particular area of focus, but also we've done iron ore, gold, other types of things as well. Next slide. Kind of went over this. Next slide. And since it was mentioned, we do have appetite in the nuclear space as well, both with kind of traditional large-scale generation and we're looking at, SMRs, the new technology as well, and our ability to support those since there's a number of U.S. companies in the small modular reactor space as well. Next slide. We also can do transactions in a project finance structure too in the transportation space. So ports, whether it's airports, inland dry ports, seaports, we have a lot of experience there too. Next slide. And then lastly, I'll just say that we do have a transportation portfolio. Next slide. And these are more done on an asset-backed structure, not as applicable to this webinar, but essentially it's where we lend to a SPV that's set up to lease the asset, whether it's an aircraft or a locomotive, to the buyer, is such that security in that asset doesn't become an issue in case a recovery is needed. Next slide. And so we've done this with all sorts of aircrafts, be it large commercial aircraft or smaller general aviation aircraft, helicopters, business jets. Next slide. And then also we've supported the rail sector globally, everywhere from Mexico to Kazakhstan. We've supported diesel as well as electric locomotives. Next slide. And with that, I'll end. There's my contact info. The one thing that I do want you to take away from this, the one critical aspect is if your company is purchasing U.S. goods and services from the U.S., please reach out to me. There's my phone number, my mobile number, my email. Please reach out to me, and now I will be happy to answer